Cauda Venenum.
Oh, that's fun. Let's hear that again.
In Cauda Venenum.
In Cauda Venenum.
In Cauda Venenum.
In Cauda Venenum. All right. In Cauda Venenum by Opeth. So, Opeth. Don't really need a introduction. I'm going to give a really sweet and succinct one. Swedish death metal darlings of the progressive rock movement, or I guess progressive metal. Really made it big in the 90s and early 2000s with such critical acclaimed albums such as Still Life and Blackwater Park. These guys are the reason why I fell in love with death metal. If it wasn't for them and Watershed, I wouldn't be listening to bands such as Baroness, Mastodon, Between the Buried and Me, Meshuggah, even some of Devin Townsend stuff. Like, these guys were the genesis for me. These guys were the ones that made me fall in love with this type of music. And then, oddly enough, the next album after Watershed, they decided, I mean, that album was literally a watershed because we entered into the late stages of the game within the band. They did away with all the death metal and put out Heritage, Pale Communion, and the latest album prior to this, Sorceress, which stopped being death metal and started being heavy metal or heavy rock. Kind of the acid rock, trippy rock from like the early to mid 70s. We're looking at like Deep Purple. We're looking at early Black Sabbath. We're looking at Uriah Heep. These 70s really heavy rock, acid rock, pseudo-metal bands and outfits. In Cauda Venenum, also known as Poison in the Tail, I believe from Latin. What does it say? Latin. It is Latin. It continues that trend. It continues with that heavy metal, acid rock feel and in tandem. And it's interesting. Each album that has been released in this latter era, I can kind of summarize into like one word, right? Like Heritage was quirky. Pale Communion was proggy. Sorceress was heavy. This one is dark. This one's probably the darkest work since Damnation. I love how dark this album feels overall. I love the atmosphere that this album sets you into. It's a quintessential fall album, and very much like a lot of metal albums of this year, I'm finding it's asking you to be patient and for you to take your time with this album, because this is an album that forces you to listen to it a number of times to really get the idea of what is going on here. I also love the fact that the chugging guitars, the big heavy riffing guitars are at a minimum. They're not completely gone. There are still a number of tracks and a number of moments that the guitar takes the center stage, but it's not the focal point throughout the entirety of the run. A lot of the times it's the atmosphere, it's the synthesizers, it's the vocal works, it's the mellotrons, it's all these experimentations with sounds to really get the feel that Opeth and Michael are really trying to get a hold of. And this opens up the album with The Garden of Earthly Delights, in that it's very haunting. Like, you can hear that there's a town going on. You can hear words and people. You can hear children. It starts off with a 80s synthesizer. And then it goes straight into Dignity. And Dignity lays down where we're going. It is heavy, it is harsh, but it's also very polished. The mixing does need a little bit of work, I feel. I don't know if the mixing is exactly where I want it to be, especially between the drumming, the vocal work, and the bass. But Dignity opens up with this very brash and abrasive oomph. Like, it's got a mellotron overlaid with Michael's vocals, and it's just like yelling out of this like bah! And then we have the typical later Opeth jamming that's going on. And I believe this actually comes in again in the fourth track of Next of Kin. They reuse that kind of theme and sound, and that's something that happens a number of times in this album, where the theme will reprise itself, and you do have to kind of like curve your head a little bit and squint, especially within like Universal Truth. I believe that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 7th track, in that it starts off in almost a predictable way. And this is one of the first times where I feel like Opeth was a little bit more predictable, a little bit too familiar. And I don't know if that was intentional. The one track in particular that I really felt this with was Forlorn Crime, the big ballad. Now, we've heard ballads like this before. My particular favorite is from Watershed of Burden. That was what made me fall in love with the band. But we also found it within, The Face of Melinda from Still Life, and a couple of tracks, Isolation Years from Ghost Reservoirs. This was one of the first ones where I'm like, okay, we're kind of retreading a little bit of the same ground. It's changed enough to make it feel new, but not so novel that I'm recognizing it for what it is. And I do enjoy the fact that it is kind of in the middle of the album, and it's followed up with one of the hardest tracks of Charlatan. And I know some people aren't a big fan of Charlatan, but I actually really, really dug this track. I love the meaty guitar hooks that are on here. I love the guitar sounds. It sounds very much like a Meshuggah sound on their guitars. Very beefy and very oomph. And I also really enjoy where this song goes as well. And specifically where the track is within the runtime of the album was really well put. In fact, all the songs are really well constructed in terms of the overall streamline of the album. This was one of the first albums, I think this is the only album within the new era that didn't feel like a collection of songs. Like even Pale Communion, as unified as Pale Communion was, it still felt like a collection of songs, whereas this album feels like a cohesive album. This feels like a fully realized work. That's with the ebbs and flows, like how Dignity flows right into Heart and Hand, and how Heart and Hand feels right into Next of Kin. Even though Heart and Hand I also feel like is a little bit of a retread of things that we've already had a little bit, like it's still pumping and it's still very energizing, and I like how the momentum that we had from Dignity launches us into Heart and Hand. And Heart and Hand is a really heavy hitting track, but it is something that I feel like I could have heard off of Sorceress. One of the more odd songs on this album that I particularly like, I believe it's called the Garroter. Garroter. I better make sure that I'm pronouncing that right. Garroter. Okay, cool. The Garroter. This is a really interesting track, and it almost feels like smooth jazz at times. Like it has that dark, smooth jazz, like almost like I feel like the devil would really like this song. Like this is something that like is very demonic and very smooth, but in a creepy, sleazy way. And the final two tracks, Continuum and All Things Will Pass, brilliant 15 minutes. Just mwah. I love the build-ups that we have in Continuum, and some of the guitar works in particular feel very much like a John Petrucci soundscape that we would have had from, say, like a Train of Thought or like a 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, something from like the first disc of 6 Degrees. I was blown away by some of the sounds that were coming out on that track of Continuum. And I also really, really liked how All Things Will Pass builded and kind of ebbed and flowed and had that finale. That finale is so well done. Like these guys did a whole lot of tricks in the air and they stuck the landing with All Things Will Pass. And I'm not a big fan of playouts as the final note of an album, but I feel like they really did a good job on this one. Another really great thing about this album, now that I've kind of talked about each of the songs individually, I want to talk about the songs in collective. I love the fact that all these songs, maybe except for Love, Lorn, Crime, they all really progress. Like they really take a page from like classic Opeth and what they were doing with Pale Communion, and the songs would wander the landscape. And the one thing that I really love about most of these songs is that they hunker down and really explore the space, especially some of the slower and more personal levels on this album. Much like a lot of metal music that we had today, the Baroness Golden Grey behind me, Tool's Fear Inoculum, they want you to be patient and they want you to really explore the territory with them as they search out and examine every nook and cranny that they're creating within this space. And I really appreciate that. I really love when a band really takes its time and just surveys the land. Like they have such a great idea. I want them to do something really interesting with it. And not only that, build upon it. So each track does build upon each one of these particular items. I think this is one of the strongest works that Opeth has put out. I know people don't like the later era Opeth, but I've really liked it. I've loved this later era Opeth. And I mean, yeah. How can I just, yeah. Boy, I'm gonna cut that out. Yeah, I've just really liked the later era Opeth because it challenges the music. Opeth was never one to pander to fans, so I like the fact that they're doing it their own way. And some of the times it works, like Pale Communion in this one. Sometimes it doesn't, like Heritage and Sorceress. Not to say that they're bad albums, I'm just saying that it didn't really hit me as much. I've been mainly listening to this album in Swedish, and I think that has really helped me digest and get into the music of this album. I love the cadence that Michael has when he sings in Swedish? In Sweden. I'm sure he sings beautifully in Sweden, but I like when he swings in Swedish. And so I've listened to it in English maybe about 2 or 3 times, but for the most part, I've been listening to this in Swedish. And I actually asked people on my Twitter how they listen to it. About 50% listen to it in English, about 25% listen to it in Swedish, and then another 25 listen to it in both and kind of flip back and forth between the two. I'm part of the 25 that listen to it predominantly in Swedish. So, final thoughts. Yeah, I love this album with my whole heart. I really do. Like, for the longest time, I was thinking, this is a pick it up in physical format, but I feel like the more I listen to it, the more I really like it, and this is a perfect fall album. So that's about it for Cauda Venenum by Opeth. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know of your own thoughts by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.